Hello everyone, my name is Justin. This video is going to cover the legacy of French and British imperial expansion and its relationship to those countries' penal colonies in the efforts of prison reform. So a little bit of context before we get directly into the topic. We need to understand what was happening around the same time with the Industrial Revolution. And what you see with the Industrial Revolution is that a lot of economic activity is being focused and centralized into the large urban environments in certain European countries. And with that large economic centralization, you have a influx of people into those cities. So that, for example, in Paris, we see that a fifth of France's population were Parisians as of 1821, people who lived in Paris. So you have this large focus and this large centralization of people into these urban communities because of the Industrial Revolution. And along with that, you see a concern from a lot of social reformers and prison reformers in the same time. And what they were concerned about was this pattern of recidivism, which is it basically describes the repetition of certain crimes by the same individuals over and over again. And this contributed to a large spike in crime in those cities at the beginning of the 19th century. Just to give one example, this is a quote from a gentleman whose name I will not attempt to pronounce, but he's discussing the issue of rehabilitation, and he's discussing it in the context of penal colonies. And basically, he argues that labor in penal colonies would, and this is where the quote begins, regenerate both physically and morally. The criminal would thus re-enter society as a useful member instead of being debased and a burden. Colonization transforms generation of criminals into veritable citizens. It attacks crime at its roots. So, this demonstrates that the desire for penal colonies, for sending convicts to these colonies and giving them hard menial labor, was the purpose of inculcating virtue in them and eliminating the vice out of them. So, the question we want to keep in mind is whether or not these efforts were actually successful. But one thing to note historically is that after this, we see that French Guiana in the northern part of South America was recognized by France as a destination for convicts as of 1854. And a little bit more context before we totally get into it. If you look at the British experience, you see that in 1807 they have the abolition of the slave trade in all of British territory. And this is what Claire Anderson has to say. Following the abolition of slave trade in 1807, labor was greatly in demand. So there was this need for either cheap or unpaid labor that was previously being met with slavery, but now that that has been abolished, it needs to be found elsewhere. So that's gonna play into the role of what's happening and what's taking place in these penal colonies. At the same time, we also see that there's an economic incentive for empires to expand into new territory around the globe. So we see that Britain actually has an economic and politically influential incentive and motive to move into the southeastern region of the globe where Australia would be. But taking a break from Britain and going back to the French experience, we see that they eventually begin sending convicts to French Guiana in the 19th century. And when they get there, there's basically three categories of convicts that are there. And you have those categories organized based on the severity of their crimes. So the first category would be compared to the lower two minor offenses, and the lowest category, the third category, would be the most severe crimes. And the third category would be most of the people who are going and doing a lot of the hard labor, a lot of the menial labor, working out in nature. And the people in the first category oftentimes were, for all practical purposes, fairly free and had a lot of liberty, and they often lived with or in the residences of a lot of the officials in the colony. And all of this was based on the susceptibility that one of the convicts had to rehab. If you committed a minor offense and you were more likely to have virtue inculcated in you and become a productive member of society, as they would have said it, then you were more likely to be put in the first category. And what we see there is that at the same time that was happening, you have a lot of administrative problems in French Guiana. So you initially, at the beginning of the colony, you have basically a skeleton crew with a hard time managing and keeping the convicts in line, and that actually follows a pattern of what was happening in that territory